Terry.
1, 2, 3.
And Ashley.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, everybody, let me check one thing, and we are live.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone this Monday to Innovations in Education. This afternoon, we're going to discuss the recent survey of Kentucky's childcare providers and the culminating report entitled A Fragile Ecosystem, the State of Childcare in Kentucky Following COVID-19 Closures. We have an expert panel here to discuss the findings and the critical importance of childcare for families and the workforce. Remember, we also will take questions from viewers on Facebook, so please post your questions in the comments section, and I'll do my best to answer them as they come in. We'll also post resources in the comments section as they are referenced by our panelists in our discussion today. Our goal this afternoon is to explore the survey results and the need for Congress to provide $50 billion in assistance to childcare as part of the federal stimulus efforts. As you listen, know that we have a call to action on our website, which you can use to immediately send an email to your congressman to let him know how important this issue is to you. We're pleased to again have Marva Johnson with us, who is interpreting for the deaf and the hard of hearing, and appreciate Marva's service, helping us get this discussion out to as many people as possible. At this time, I'd like to introduce Kevin Middleton, President of United Way of Kentucky, who is with us to share background on the survey and to introduce our panelists today. So Kevin, at this point, let me turn it over to you to give us all the background on this really important work.
Thank you, Bridget, and welcome to all of you who have joined us today again via Facebook Live and YouTube. It's my understanding that Congressman Yarmouth, chair of the House Budget Committee, is also in the audience, and I want to extend a particular thank you to him and to all of the elected officials who tuned in today to this report and panel discussion. As Bridget has mentioned, I'm president for United Way of Kentucky, the network of 22 United Way organizations serving the Commonwealth. United Way fights for the financial stability, the health, and education of every person in every community. And for nearly 3 months, businesses and families have anchored themselves to the hope of weathering the COVID-19 pandemic and getting back to some semblance of normalcy. But a growing concern for many is the impact that COVID-19 has had on a system of childcare that was already fragile and suffered from inadequate public support. We know that from 2013 to the early months of 2020, the number of regulated providers in Kentucky dropped from 4,400 to just 2,172, a loss of over half in 7 years. Moreover, as noted in the Prichard Committee's 2017 Cost of Quality report, public support for childcare has been insufficient to provide quality full-day care to enough working families, and centers continue to struggle to stay afloat. The crisis now facing state budgets, particularly here in Kentucky, will make even current levels of public investment all but impossible in the near term. Therefore, in May, a small coalition of childcare advocates asked those on the ground, the providers themselves, to complete a survey that would help inform organizations, as well as local, state, and federal government, of the real impact of COVID-19 on providers. The Kentucky Childcare Provider Survey was conducted as a partnership between United Way of Kentucky, the Prichard Committee for Academic Excellence, Kentucky Youth Advocates, Childcare Advocates Kentucky, Metro United Way, Learning Grove, and United Greater Cincinnati. We are particularly grateful to one of our panelists today, Dr. Sarah Vanover, Director of the Kentucky Division of Childcare, for helping to distribute this survey to our providers. As we'll discuss in a while, the results of the survey show the need for greater financial support from Congress and continued engagement, planning with providers at the state level. Both are critical in ensuring that Kentucky's childcare infrastructure is sustained for the short and long term. Now, before we continue, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Our long-term advocate and ally, Dr. Terry Brooks, Executive Director of Kentucky Youth Advocates. Our partner in serving the business community throughout the Commonwealth, Ashley Watts, President and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. As previously mentioned, Dr. Sarah Vanover, Director for the Kentucky Division of Childcare. Louisville provider Bridget Yates, the Executive Director of the Cornerstone Child Development Center. And Amy Neal, the newly appointed Executive Director for the Governor's Office of Early Childhood. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Bridget.
Kevin, thank you for that background on why this study is so important. We're going to get into all of the details on the study, but I want to bring us back up kind of to the treetops, so to speak, before we get into the depths of the study, and turn to Amy Neal first in her new role as Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Early Childhood. But early childhood is not new to Amy Neal. Amy Neal and I go back quite a few years, having both worked in Northern Kentucky as early childhood advocates for the state of Kentucky, for United Way actually, but on behalf of Kentucky families and children. So Amy, I'd just like for you to share with us and with viewers kind of the background on the importance of early learning and how high quality childcare can support the educational development of our youngest learner. Why is this conversation so critical?
Sure. Bridget, I just really want to thank you so much for having me be a part of this conversation today, and thank the advocates and early childhood educators and stakeholders who pulled this important data together. As I had a chance to take a look at the executive summary, it's really, it's great data. It's really important data. And I just want to say thank you so much. But this is not going to be news to anybody on this call, how important the early years are. And, really what we know is that when children start school behind, they stay behind. And for so many of those children, they're so far behind, they never have the opportunity to catch up. And, economists have found that early care and education has one of the highest rates of return for any other stage of development. So, you can really think of investing early as just a really smart investment. So that it's not like it's a controversy at all to invest in high quality early care and education. In the Commonwealth last year, 49% of children were not ready when they entered kindergarten last year. And so, that's something that we all can do something about, and we need to do something about, because there's no timeouts for kids. So we need to do something about that, right? And then just the last thing I just want to reinforce, because this is something I think that gets missed a lot of the time, is that over 85% of brain development happens before the age of 5. So we can't wait until kids are 4. The first 3 years, that's when the brain grows most rapidly.
And that is such an important point to underscore, Amy. I think that those first 3 years, first 3 to 5 years are the time in human development when the brain is growing at its most rapid. And all of the development that's happening in the brain at that time sets our littlest learners up for success in school and in life. Yep. And so it is an investment with a significant return. Not only a significant return for our littlest learners, though, because it's also a critical support for families in the workforce. And with that note, thinking about the dual importance of childcare, I'd like to turn now to Ashley Watts, the president and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, just to share the business community's perspective and the importance that they place on the availability of childcare, and hopefully in a growing fashion, the availability of high quality childcare.
Absolutely. And thank you, Bridget, for inviting me. You guys may have seen me kind of speak off screen just a minute ago. I am living all of this right now. I have my 7-year-old daughter at my conference table right next to my office. My 4-year-old son is with my mother today, and we're just kind of all hands on deck trying to figure out what to do when you have working parents as well as children who need high quality childcare, camps, and all of that we're typically used to, that unfortunately for the last couple of months we have not had access to. So I am kind of living and breathing exactly what we're talking about today. And I was always, and the chamber has been as well, a huge supporter of quality early childhood education. But I think during these last couple of months, all of us have really realized the importance of it. And hopefully we have kept our children on track to go into the next school year. But I know as a mother, that's been a concern to me is, are my children going to miss something in these last couple of months kind of being shuffled around? But from the business community perspective, it really is kind of a twofold benefit. The first benefit, like Amy said, is that a child's brain develops faster in those formative years before the age of 5 than any other time in your life. So when you're talking about a highly qualified, educated workforce here in Kentucky, the work starts in quality early childhood care. And we know that now. We need to set that foundation to make sure that we have the workforce of tomorrow. But also, on the other hand, it's a workforce issue right now. Just like I said, I have my daughter next to me, hopefully staying quiet for the next hour or so while I'm doing this. We now know more than ever that childcare is needed for a workforce of today. We have most adults there. She is in the back. She loves making Zoom appearances. She always knows when to kind of come and say hello. This is Emma. She's 7. So it's a workforce issue. And we know now, as people are starting to go back to work, post-COVID, that we now have a childcare issue as well. Because if you don't have childcare, some people are not like I am, as fortunate as I am that I'm able to bring my kids to work when I need to. We have another option. So it really is a workforce issue now. We've seen employers, thanks to our partnership with the Prichard Committee and KYA and others over the last couple of years, really get on board with this, realizing how important it is to all work across the state. And so they've been, we've made great strides in the last couple of years talking about the importance of early childhood. We have some great, employers here in Kentucky. I always think of Rockcastle Hospital that has a childcare facility on site. Toyota in Georgetown has a facility on site because they know how important it is to have that strong foundation for the children of their workforce. So right now we're all kind of figuring out what is going on with, the future of childcare, but however the best the business community can serve is what we want to do. I think we all realize the critical importance of it. And I would say in the surveys that we've had of our membership across the state over the last couple of months, this really has been the top concern. This has been the number one thing. The top barrier to getting the workforce back to work has been the lack of childcare. So we are optimistic over the next couple of weeks that we're going to be able to open childcare in a safe and methodical way and keep everyone safe and hopefully get some people back to work that had not been able to do so and to get kids back to a routine. So however the business community can help, we really see it as a twofold issue, the workforce of today, but also the workforce of tomorrow.
Indeed. So important. Ashley, thank you. And according to the U.S. Chamber Foundation, on average, they've documented that U.S. states $1 billion annually due to breakdowns in childcare. So this has been a significant issue before the pandemic, and the pandemic just exacerbated the issue that already was. So at this point, Sarah, I'd like to turn to you. You were there on the front lines as the pandemic began to hit Kentucky, and it was clear that we needed to close childcare, we needed to close schools, we needed to be healthy at home. And you've been building the plane as you're flying it, no doubt, trying to figure out how we safeguard childcare, and at the same time make the difficult decisions at the state level that you've had to make. So give us a little bit of background on what you're hearing from other providers, what the needs are, and what things you hope will look like in the coming weeks.
Well, I appreciate your analogy about building the plane as you're flying it. I've reached out to other states and those who lead childcare in the other states, and there was not a great deal of federal guidance on how to support our childcare programs during this time. And so we really had to look at our individual states and the situation that we had. Some states were hit harder by COVID-19 than others. Some had many more childcare programs. We have lots of states that have 4,000 to 5,000 childcare programs. Now, Kentucky, although it only has around 2,200 childcare programs, we're 90 to 95% center-based. So we have a large volume. Many of the programs we've lost over the past few years have been family childcare homes that do have smaller program sizes. But right now we need all capacity, everything to stay. When we had to make the call to close childcare programs due to the spread of the virus, we did have the opportunity to set up emergency childcare programs throughout the state. And those have been monitored by the Division of Regulated Childcare. We had approximately 80 of those. Some did not stay open because they didn't get the enrollment that they anticipated, and they were losing a great deal of money. And really, we had capacity for about 6,000 children to be in childcare throughout the state during this time period. And we only really maxed out at about 1,800. Parents were just making any alternate arrangement they could if they had the opportunity to do so. And then, so we had those 80 emergency programs plus all the rest. When we got our CARES dollars, we needed to find a way to distribute those funds among all programs. We have 28,000 children that receive CCAP, but those subsidy families, the ones that receive subsidy, only make up about 17% of the families that utilize childcare in the state out of the 165,000 slots available. And what we know from that is that even with 165,000 slots, 65 of our counties still are childcare deserts and do not have enough childcare available for the families in their county that have young children and need to utilize childcare. So we were kind of at an impasse on how the best way to reduce childcare for the spread of illness, but still make sure that families had what they needed. CARES dollars were distributed throughout programs, and we're getting ready to issue the last stipend for cleaning and personal protective equipment, and that's going to be going out soon. But as we're looking at this reopening plan, there was a huge balancing act that had to take place. We had to make sure that children are remaining safe and healthy, but programs get the revenue that they need to stay open. And that's been complicated. The CDC has had guidelines out during the past 2.5 months for programs that stay open, whether they were emergency programs or what type, on what they would like to see. And for those of you who work in childcare, when you read the recommendations, as a past director and past teacher, when I read those recommendations, I think, is this even possible when you have a room full of children? When you think about distancing children and the reduction of staff exposure and things like that, it's been challenging to find the most reasonable way to reopen. We are going forward with a plan that we know will have some negative impact on programs, but not a devastating impact. Hopefully, we're going to work with group sizes of 10. We're going to keep those 10 children together all day long, instead of exposing them to other groups of children throughout the building, whether it be through field trips or transportation or shared playground time. We are going to have staff members using PPE in the centers, but not young children, to reduce suffocation, strangulation, things like that.
Right. And that's an important point, Sarah. I want to stop you there for a minute, because we have been hearing in the last few days concern from childcare providers or parents about young children wearing masks. Maybe even childcare providers wearing masks when children can't see their provider's facial expression. And kind of when we're talking about the brain being at its most rapid development point during those years. What are you thinking about those? We have the health and safety protection for sure, but from a development standpoint, have you wrestled with that type of an issue?
Oh, yes. I can't tell you, writing these reopening guidelines, I have stayed up at night running it through my head, thinking through multiple scenarios.
And as a former director.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. And, the 0 to 3 age group is the one that I'm most concerned about seeing facial expressions interaction, because that's when we're developing our attachment and our language skills. We have tweaked our plan a little bit to allow the clear face shields in those infant and toddler classrooms so that more facial expression can be seen. The face shields allow for a little more blowback of air in them and things like that. But, overall, it reduces the risk, and it still allows our babies and our toddlers to see our faces, to see the lip movement for the articulation of language. We are asking preschool and school age teachers to continue to wear cloth masks or disposable masks. And maybe we'll get to the point where we can have everybody utilizing the face shield. But we do want to make some concessions for that infant and toddler group because of the fact that the development of attachment and language is so significant in that 0 to 3 age range.
Yeah. That we're having that level of discussion is so important to understand all the impacts. Then there's, of course, the impact of children in the child care center and where the children then might be on the weekends and if they're around older grandparents, that sort of thing. So the protections are still critical. So it's a really difficult balancing act. We know that that you're doing. And I want to thank you again for joining the very first week of the pandemic, when so little was known and there was so much uncertainty. And Sarah, you were so gracious to jump on our Facebook Live that week. I believe it was March 19th, maybe, to just go ahead and have a conversation about what was going to happen. So thank you for all the transparency from the Division of Child Care in working with child care providers to get where we need to be to open safely. So we're going to get into more of the child care provider kind of impact with Bridget Yates soon, but I want to turn first to Terry Brooks as a main partner. Kentucky Youth Advocates is a main partner in the development of the survey that went out to child care providers with an incredible response rate, and the final report. So Terry, why did you and other partners feel it was important to survey Kentucky's child care providers about the impact of COVID-19?
Well, Bridget, you know, the folks on this call and so many other folks, frankly, leaders like Congressman Yarmouth, have worked for so many years to increase access to safe and quality childcare. Because as we've all said, we know that's good for kids, good for parents, and good for the economy. And yet we also knew that even before the pandemic, some 52% of Kentuckians lived in a child care desert, which means there weren't enough providers to ensure that all the parents who needed child care had access to it. And even before the pandemic, we knew that many child care providers are nothing but small businesses.
That's right.
Operating on a razor thin margin. So we knew when the pandemic hit that child care would be extremely vulnerable, that it would be at a risk of closing without emergency funding. We knew the vital way, as we've talked, that childcare played for local economies, as well as moms and dads and kids themselves. So we had to think about how could we act effectively in these unprecedented times. And we have found, and I know many folks on the call would agree with this, that whether it's in the middle of COVID or more normal times, that policymakers rely on factual, unbiased data. Despite what is the popular narrative, we have found lawmakers in both Washington and Frankfurt, very thoughtful folks who need facts, not rhetoric, to animate their thinking. So in this case, the clear and certain best data source we felt was from providers themselves. We wanted to hear from providers. We wanted to document the impact for our state and federal leaders to help stimulate, to help target stimulus efforts to ensure that childcare was a major priority, because what we're talking about here is in fact a policy strategy. So at the end of the day, and I realize we're going to talk about content, but if we talk about purpose of the study, this study can be a real tool, whether it's working with our congressional delegation to secure that additional $50 billion in stimulus funding for childcare that you referenced. Frankly, we also have to continue to work with our state leaders around Kentucky's budget. It is not unrealistic to think that tough budget decisions are going to be made in the next few weeks and or months. We've got to be able to put childcare on the front as a priority. So the real test question for this study, or probably any study, is so what? And the bottom line is, if we can answer that question in a few months by asserting that we have leveraged this data to make a difference for kids and for families and for the vibrancy of the workforce, then the results have been worth the effort. I heard a great story this weekend. A person was observing that he wanted to go out like his grandfather, quiet, peaceful, and asleep, not like the people screaming who were the other passengers in the car. Well, what we have to do is make sure that the childcare doesn't go out quietly, that we have to keep it vibrant. And we hope that this particular study, this survey, can be that real catalyst to talk to folks in Frankfurt and to talk to folks in Washington.
Great points, Terry. Now is the time for us to be really thinking around the corner, to have a better handle on kind of how we can position ourselves to be strong into the future, really thinking about innovation and getting the voice directly from providers as to what will work and maybe what won't work for them, and their service to our littlest learners is critical as we try to position ourselves on the inside of the curve around the corner into the future. So Bridget Yates, I'd like to turn to you as a child care provider. What's it been like in your child care facilities shut down?
I think, Bridget, you said it best. We're building the plane while we fly it. And our story is probably relatively typical. Centers like ours, about 150 kids and about 40 staff, and we had to furlough our staff. But we elected to continue to pay their health care and other benefit costs because we wanted to ensure that our staff would return. So we wanted to kind of help support them and take care of them, but also we are a small nonprofit and wanting to stay financially viable. So it's been juggling, 10 balls in the air at a time, and always having about 60% of the information that we need to be able to make a really good decision. So it's, it's such a fluid situation. So we're looking now, although we can open on the 15th, we've elected to wait to the 29th. We feel like we have to make some significant changes to the layout of our building and create systems that have not been in place before. And we think 2 weeks worth of additional wisdom in this scenario is a huge amount of wisdom. And so we wanted the additional 2 weeks so that we could do things well and right and get our staff input and train them and have them ready. But we're returning with a situation that we anticipate we will be losing about $10,000 a week to reopen. But the financial cost of not reopening and having our families find alternate childcare is a far worse financial scenario long term, having to start over and rebuilding for these 150 kids that we serve. So it's been, although we understand the need for the new regulations and we support that, making it work is kind of a whole different thing. And so trying to do right by the kids that we serve, obviously, trying to do right by the staff, trying to take care of the families and be able to provide the service that we know is needed in our community, and doing all of that, knowing that at any moment, everything that we know could change and we could be kind of regrouping and restructuring all over again. So it's stressful. A lot of the gray hairs new. It's like the last 8 weeks or so. We know that, we have a great staff. We have very supportive families. We are a community, but there's nothing about this that's been easy or,
So you said you serve 150 youngsters, infants, toddlers, and 3 and 4 year olds?
And 5-year-olds.
And 5-year-olds. And how many staff do you have?
We have about 40 on staff.
40 on staff, 150 kids. Did you lay all of your 40 staff off?
Yeah, so everyone was furloughed. And so they were eligible then for unemployment insurance. And then we've still just had to pay for their benefit costs and still our utilities and rent and, just kind of our overhead we've continued to pay. So at the beginning of this, we were in what we thought was kind of a good position. We had managed to save up about $175,000 in cash. Mm-hmm. So we thought, in the beginning, we had no idea how long this closure would last. We thought maybe 2 weeks. So we thought we were in a really good position to be able to weather the storm. And so to watch that amount of money that took us years, like I said, we're a small nonprofit. And so we're already operating on such a thin margin. So for us to have accumulated $175,000 in cash, that was years worth of work. And so to watch that really just kind of diminish pretty quickly over the last few months, we felt like we just needed to survive in advance every day. Like, what decisions can we make right now to hold on to our cash, reduce our costs, and survive and live into next month, and then kind of reassessing month to month.
Right. And, you know, it's important, I think, that we just kind of remind folks that childcare is a small business. Your main, if not your only source of revenue is the paying family for the childcare service. And for some families, CCAP, Child Care Assistance Program from the state. But without that revenue, you know, you can't make ends meet unless you have that nest egg stashed back, which I'm sure you had other visions for how you might use that.
Of course, we were dreaming big right before this happened. And so, you know, it's, we had been saving to be able to make some changes to our building, which we are going to be making, but now they're going to look more like walls and dividing and kind of becoming more in line with the new regulations, and not what we had envisioned before about just improving, you know, new flooring and new shelving and those kinds of things. So it's going to be used to change our building, but just not at all like we had envisioned.
And I'm guessing you were not able to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program because of the need to furlough staff. Is that right?
We were able to get a PPP loan. And now that the payback timeline has changed for that, that will be helpful for us tremendously. We were concerned initially that we weren't even going to reopen within our 8-week period to spend it and have it forgiven. But now that that regulation has changed, that was tremendous for us. So we look right now in terms of, you know, we got the CARES Act money, and that replaced about 1 week of revenue for us. We have now the PPP loan, and that's going to cover about 8 weeks of revenue for us. And so looking at once we reopen, and we know we'll be operating at a deficit, trying to translate those resources into how many weeks can those resources supplement the tuition that parents are going to be paying, because we have far fewer kids returning on the 29th when we reopen than we had in March.
Well, because the other side of that is then how many of those parents have jobs where they've been able to kind of relocate and work from home? How many of them were furloughed or laid off? So the other side of that coin, I think when we talk about childcare, thinking about the service for the child, but also the support for the families, it's critical on this issue. It's a both and.
It is, and we're finding there's always something that we hadn't anticipated that happened. That's part of my daily life right now. And we're just finding that even though we think that, you know, we're working to become financially viable, there are families that are nervous that what is the financial future of this business? And so should we make alternate childcare plans, like getting a nanny in our home, or because this is a small business that may not survive this?
Yeah. Ashley, what are you hearing from businesses and their demand for childcare, their employee demand?
Absolutely. And the story talked about of saving up that money. I mean, that you guys are a small nonprofit, and we hear those same stories from small businesses all across Kentucky right now of saving up, and all, you know, in a few short months, everything has been lost. We have been surveying our membership every single week, basically, since all of this started in mid-March. I know it seems longer ago than that, but in mid-March. And really, like I said earlier, the top concern of our membership across the board was really access to childcare. That was the top barrier. Transportation was also an issue, but really childcare was one of the top issues. And so right now, our members are having to be somewhat creative and figuring out how to still have childcare and get your workforce back to work. And so though it looks very unusual and pretty unorthodox, and it's not something that any of us would want to do for long periods of time, we now see employers saying, you can bring your children to work, you can, we'll keep a group of them here and maybe hire a teenager, which is not, like we all know, quality childcare like we're used to, but really just trying to do whatever we can to make sure that parents can come back to work and the children have some place to go. We've heard also that over the next couple of weeks, because of some of the restrictions with the number of class sizes, which we understand that some parents are not able to get their children into the back into the childcare or into a camp as they typically would have because of the size limits. So we're trying to just encourage employers to really be as flexible as possible, to let people work from home if they can, and most are, obviously for health reasons as well. So right now it's kind of all hands on deck when it comes to helping employers navigate this uncertainty, because as we all know, it's a huge barrier right now. So we're just trying to help employers with any resources they have, but it absolutely is the top concern of our employers across our membership is the future of childcare and what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. We do have a few questions coming in. A question from Cindy Heine. Those in the early childhood space know Cindy well. So Cindy writes specifically to Sarah, did the centers who stayed open since March experience any cases of the COVID-19 virus? And she's wondering basically how well the protocol set up for those centers worked.
The emergency centers that have been open since March did not have a child or a teacher that contracted COVID-19. Now, many of those, the requirements for the limited duration childcare facilities were looser in terms of regulations on our end. However, since they were monitored by hospitals and a hospital had to partner with them in order to open, the hospital pretty much is who put very strict protocol in place for those programs. And many of the hospitals had them doing temperature checks multiple times throughout the day. They asked their hospital staff to change out of their scrubs before they picked them up. There were lots of different protocols that were put in place because of that. And the requirements for that, since they were emergency facilities, were not as extensive as we would have typical in any type of regulations. But we are following the pattern that many of them did, even when they didn't have it in regulation. We're doing the smaller group sizes. We're doing a centralized location for drop off and pickup so that parents aren't unnecessarily traveling back and forth to classrooms. We're making sure that teachers stay with the same age groups as much as possible, and that we don't have floating teachers hopping from one classroom to another throughout the day. And we're continuing to do those protocols with the personal protective equipment and with medical screenings upon arrival to make sure that anyone who is ill does not enter the child care program. We also did a lot of research among other states. I stayed in pretty close contact with over 20 other states to see what type of protocols they had in place and what their success had been, and to get an idea of what was keeping our children healthy and safe in other states also.
We had sort of the same question from Pamela Isaac. So Pamela, we hope that answered your question as well about how have kids stayed COVID-free so far. We also have a question from Valerie Frost, and Sarah, this goes back to the question that I asked you about face masks for 0 to 3-year-olds. And she's asking, what about 0 to 5 and children of all ages with special needs? What if they have an IEP or a 504 plan? Are there waivers or exceptions for some children?
So right now, the face shields will only be for 0 to 3. However, we have made some different alterations for children with a 504 or an IEP. Whereas we've limited the amount of people, visitors that can come into the program at all during this time period. If anyone is providing medical or therapeutic support to a child with special needs, they will still have access to those services while they're in the center. So if somebody from First Steps or an OT, PT, ABA therapist, things like that need to come and work with a child, particularly during such a dramatic transition of going from center life back to home, back to a center. And I know I have a child with an IEP and a 504 plan, and this has been very confusing for him. So we want to make sure that those protocols are in place to assist them during this transition as much as possible. But at this point in time, the face shields will only be used for the 0 to 3 population.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. So I just want to, there's a call to action in the report, and I hope those interested in listening today will download the report. It's chock full of good information. And one of the recommendations is that Governor Beshear would put together a task force for childcare, for the future of childcare. And Amy and Terry, I'm interested in your thoughts there. As you know, as a state in the last few years, we've had a variety of discussions about task forces for preschool, early learning. This one is specifically to create a COVID-19 childcare task force. So your thoughts on the need for that and what might come out of such a task force? And Terry, you're on mute. Almost, I think. Amy, you can jump in if you want.
Okay. So, I mean, a couple
Got it.
things.
Go ahead, Amy, and then we'll get to Terry.
Okay, so I mean, a couple things come to mind. So of course, I mean, the highest level of leadership should be talking about this because it's critical. You know, it's valuable. We need to be talking about that. It's important enough that it should be a priority, right? And increasing access to high quality services is a priority. And, you know, the other thing that comes to mind for me is that ensuring that kids come out on the other side of poverty who are experiencing multidimensional needs, that's very, very complex work. And so that means all of us have to work together towards a common goal. We have to be united at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, to ensure that we're using resources in the most efficient way possible, because there just aren't enough resources to go around. And also to make sure that families can easily navigate systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, whenever we can work together to make it easier for families and to shore up resources, that's absolutely what we should be doing.
We think about childcare, not just as childcare kind of as we've come to know it, small business, but also preschool services and Head Start and blended and braided programs. Using all of those resources efficiently is something that's critically important.
Well,
and this task force could take up.
Right. So if you think about K to 12, it's a pretty clearly defined system. And what's so difficult about birth to 5 is that it's not a system at all. Children are born and then 5 years later they show up for kindergarten and we hope they're ready. Mm-hmm. And hope is just not a strategy.
Yeah,
it's very difficult. And so that's why it's critically important for all of these advocates and all of these stakeholders and all of our cross-sector partners to work together, as difficult as it is, and it is, to work towards a common goal.
Yeah, the report I think is aptly named A Fragile Ecosystem, and indeed the early childhood space is an ecosystem.
That's right.
Terry, you know as well as I do in this advocacy space, over the last 7 years, we've lost half of our childcare in the state. And COVID is set to wipe out another big bunch of it if we're not careful.
Right.
What are your thoughts, Terry, about the task force?
Yeah, well, the good news, I think, for kids is that we have people like Amy and Sarah, conversations additionally with Secretary Friedlander and Lieutenant Governor Coleman would indicate that the administration has good ears when it comes to this issue. I would hope that that any group that is set up, and this may be sacrilegious on this particular call, but it's beyond just childcare. Let's talk about young kids. For instance, we know the role that early childhood education plays in prevention. It is very bad news that child abuse reports in Kentucky have plummeted because no one thinks there's less child abuse today than there was before COVID-19 began. Instead, reporting systems have been put on hold. We all have lots of conversations about trauma-informed care and resiliency building. Does childcare play a role in that? Absolutely. But so do moms and dads and faith communities and other kind of community institutions. So the idea of the state tackling a task force around young kids in all aspects, whether that's food supply or abuse, childcare services, or resiliency building, is very appealing to me. I would say that I think it's vital that if that group comes together, Bridget, you know that I'm a big fan of John Cotter and how he talks about leading change. You know, one of his criticals on effective change is a guiding coalition. That guiding coalition, he suggests, are unlikely voices, voices of influence and expertise, of leadership and management. So if that group is put together, let's look at young kids holistically, not just in one sector. And let's make sure that a vast array of voices are represented. If we could develop a holistic group making holistic recommendations, then we just might find some pragmatic common ground to respond to the situation at hand.
Yeah, great points, and clearly an imperative. Kevin, let me turn back to you, since you've listened to the conversation and you've been deeply involved in the survey process and the report. Share with us now, as we've kind of established that shared foundation of knowledge in the conversation, what are some of the biggest takeaways from the survey? And what do you hope state and federal lawmakers take from these results?
Sure, thank you, Bridget. And I want to say first to Terry's point earlier, the fact that lawmakers needed a better, more accurate voice, a more accurate picture of what was happening in Kentucky. When I brought this concept to this small work group of launching this survey, we knew that we had to do something a little bit different, right? Because the national surveys were not providing a full representative voice of what was happening on the ground in Kentucky. So we decided that we were going to carry this forward. And I'll start by saying that we were grateful and absolutely humbled by the number of providers that wanted to share their story. Of the nearly 2,200 providers in the state, we received over 1,500 responses to this survey. And those results showed that nearly 95% of the centers responding were completely closed due to COVID-19. That was to be expected. But at least 11% of those responding expect to close permanently due to the financial impact of the shutdown. And that number exceeds 15% when considering those who were uncertain given the circumstances at the time the survey was launched. So what does that mean for Kentucky? Well, the majority of surveyed providers, 34%, served between 50 and 100 children at their centers. Another 23% of respondents signaled their center serves more than 100 kids, bringing the percent of providers serving more than 50 kids in Kentucky, those that responded, to over 58%. Approximately 52% of our providers have between 10 and over 50 employees. Another 27% of those surveyed have between 5 and 10 staff. And then 57.1% of centers surveyed serve at least some children funded through CCAP. Nearly a quarter said that half or more of their kids came from CCAP recipient families. So in other words, the loss of 11 to 15% of child care providers in the state will be a significant blow to the early learning capacity of local communities, particularly for low-income families receiving CCAP support, as well as to Kentucky's workforce. Now, speaking of the workforce, approximately 66% of providers surveyed have laid off their staff completely during the shutdown. 67% of those employees are relying on unemployment insurance for income, according to the survey. Meanwhile, we can see that centers are working. The Division of Childcare announced that centers would receive stipend and continue to pay childcare assistance and parent copays to help cover losses during the shutdown. So we asked centers to answer the following: with combined federal and state assistance, would their program be able to cover the costs of being closed. 393 centers, that's over 30% of the responders said no. All current assistance combined still wouldn't cover their costs. We know that rent or mortgage and wages have been the largest expense for providers since the shutdown began. We also know that the chief concern of surveyed providers is the health and safety of the children and staff when the centers reopen. The ongoing ability to pay their staff is the next most important concern to them. So to sum this up, we know that nationally, results from the National Survey of Early Care and Education state that in order to sustain the child care system for both essential workers during the crisis and ensure that it can reopen in recovery, nearly $9.6 billion per month of new investment is necessary. Therefore, at the federal level, we're calling on Congress to provide $50 billion in assistance to childcare as part of the current federal stimulus efforts. The assistance must also allow states like Kentucky to support operating costs during mandated closures and our capacity restrictions that we've been talking about, as well as co-pays, tuition based on enrollment, training and professional development, and facility maintenance and cleaning. Support will also be needed to cover the costs for reopening and rehiring, obviously, as restrictions on operating are phased out. So at the state level, as you mentioned, Bridget, we're asking Governor Beshear to continue his support for the effect by further elevating childcare as a part of the critical infrastructure necessary for Kentucky to be healthy at work by creating a COVID-19 child care task force. Doing so would ensure that necessary feedback could be collected from providers, families, businesses, and communities on sector needs, and would inform the allocation of any additional federal assistance. So with that, Bridget, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. Kevin, thank you. We do have a question coming in from Sandy Woodall in Northern Kentucky, and she asks how the current governor's appointed Child Care Advisory Council could be utilized in the idea of a COVID-19 task force. Was that discussed by the partners, or Amy, is this something on your radar, or Sarah, yours? From a leadership standpoint, that Child Care Council has been in place for a few years now. So how do you see that dovetailing with the task force?
You know, the Early Childhood Advisory Council is under Amy's office and branch, but I will say that it does entail a lot of different parts of early childhood representation. It's not just childcare, it's not just public school, preschool. We have representation on there from First Steps and from communities, and so it does utilize a lot of the people that we need to bring to the table in order to make these decisions. And we do have other groups throughout the state, like the Child Care Advisory Council. And for our office, one of the things that we have to have by federal mandate is a group that assesses emergency preparedness. So we've had to, during this time for COVID-19, we've had to pull together those team members from Department of Public Health, from Division of Regulated Childcare, Childcare, Amy's office, and all sit down together and say, okay, at this point, if we're going to have emergency licensed centers, how do we do that? If we're going to protect the health and safety of the kids for reopening, how are we going to do that? And so there have been large group of stakeholders in different settings that have come together during this time period. A lot of it, you know, for many of us who serve on these committees, we serve on the same committees again and again with lots of different people. I mean, just the people on this Zoom meeting I see on a regular basis right now. A lot of it, I don't know if it's even making more committees as it is making sure that specific time is dedicated in each of these groups to address these issues and to move forward so that every group is on the same page with one another and we don't become siloed apart from one another. So as we think about utilizing ECAC, making sure that those meetings coming up have dedicated time to talk about how do we help our field move forward. The Child Care Advisory Council is the same way, taking dedicated time to make sure that everybody says, these are the needs of the community. How do we ask for those needs? How do we get people to support us? What are we doing to help providers?
Yeah.
And utilizing those groups in that manner.
Yeah. Underscoring that this needs to be a unified system, an ecosystem. And so Amy, Sandra kind of underscores your point that resources are limited and we need to think about how we could tap into current resources. So that's the reason for her question about utilizing the existing childcare council. And so maybe, Amy, you have some thoughts on expanding it or utilizing it with a unified approach.
Anybody that's ever worked with me knows that I'm a fan of not duplicating and working smarter, not harder. I've had the honor of being at the governor's office of early childhood for about a month. And I've been so impressed with Dr. Vanover and her team and others. And I think we're so fortunate to have some of the experts that we do. And so I think it's really, really important. Everybody's working so hard. And, you know, we talked about there aren't enough resources to go around. So let's not meet each other coming and going. So let's ask what existing groups are out there. What's the purpose? And let's, you know, have those Dr. Phil moments and say, how's that working for us? Let's make sure we're using data to drive decision-making. So yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Sarah said, but you know, I say this to my team a lot too. I just got here.
Yeah.
You know,
You can only say that for so long, Amy, right?
I know.
But your point about using data for decision making and also then using data to evaluate our efforts. So coming out of this crisis, what is the demand for childcare? And this survey helps us with some of these questions. What is the demand? Do we have the demand where it's most needed to support the needs of the workforce? Is it at a level of quality? And do we see those things increasing? Because we know the return on investment increases when we increase quality. So the evaluation component as a strategic priority is so critically important as well. If we're going to ensure that we really are moving our state forward with early childhood as part of that mix. So with that, Kevin, I'd like to just kind of come back to you as we're nearing the top of our hour together and ask you to provide some wrap-up comments for us as we all go out and begin to make this happen.
Sure, thanks, Bridget. Now, as you've been talking about here, a healthy childcare sector is vitally important to creating an educational foundation for our youngest kids, right? Quality childcare programs improve the social development, the emotional growth, and kids, and it enables their families to participate in the workforce. The needs of childcare providers and parents must be given right now the attention and resources that they deserve at the state and federal levels. As Amy pointed out, this is one of the most critical sectors in our society. As Ashley pointed out, the business community knows as we begin to reopen, we're asking for federal government to commit $50 billion of federal investment for childcare. And we're asking for a dedicated task force at the state level, a group, whether it's existing or a new group, to focus solely on this issue so that we can ensure childcare successfully reopens and sustainable into the future, and particularly over the next 12 to 18 months. Thanks again, Vivian.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. If you'd like to let Congress know how important childcare is to you and how important it is that they include funding for childcare in the stimulus package at a level of $50 billion, that would result in close to $1 billion for Kentucky. Please see the comment section of our Facebook Live page where we'll have a link to a call to action that you can utilize to get that message to Congress quickly. And you can also visit our website, prichardcommittee.org. I'd like to thank each one of our panelists for being with us this afternoon to talk about this important work and talk about reopening childcare safely with the needs of our students first and foremost in our minds and the needs of our workforce. So thank you each for being with us this afternoon and for the work that you've done on this study. Next week on Innovations in Education, our online broadcast will focus on how lack of internet access in rural and low-income communities is impacting education, business, and healthcare due to COVID-19. Panelists will join us from 55,000 Degrees, the Kentucky Farm Bureau, the Mountain Association of Economic and Community Development, and the Pew Research Center. We're also planning several virtual events for the week of June 22nd to discuss equity and excellence in our schools as we all are dealing with the aftermath of recent police brutality and the rising protests and marches for Black Lives Matter. So watch for that the week of June 22nd. And note that we will be moving our future broadcast to Wednesdays at 3 p.m. for the summer months. So we look forward to seeing everybody Wednesdays at 3. And don't forget, you can watch an archive of this program on YouTube. So thank you all again for being with us, and have a wonderful Monday evening.